Theoretical Times, a podcast series between Tara Brabazon and Steve Redhead. Hello, my name is Tara Brabazon, and it's my great pleasure to introduce the next instalment of Theoretical Times. And it's my pleasure, quite shortly, to be introducing Professor Steve Redhead. But this is a really special podcast for me because I'm talking about a scholar who really transformed my life. Let me go back a bit. I was enrolled in a traditional, very conservative and indeed very atheoretical history degree at the University of Western Australia when dinosaurs still roamed the earth. And in my honours year, I was trying to, quote-unquote, read theory. I read Louis Althusser's Lenin and Philosophy. At that moment, my life changed. Up until then, everything I'd read in that history degree I'd understood, and understood very easily. It was straightforward. But this great essay I didn't understand. I was clear that it was fascinating, that it was difficult, that it was complex, but I couldn't understand it all. So I read it, and I reread it, and I reread it, and I reread it, each time understanding it a little bit more and a little bit better. Althusser opened me up to another world of ideas. So it seems appropriate to base this Theoretical Times podcast on Louis Althusser, born in 1918 and dying in 1990. Althusser was political in a way that is deeply recognisable in our own present. He stated in that great essay, Lenin and Philosophy, that, quote, everything which touches on politics may be fatal to philosophy, for philosophy lives on politics, end of quote. So, Steve, hello.
Hello.
We've got to Althusser. We were probably always heading to the Althusser podcast, but are you comfortable with the description of Althusser as a structuralist, and how has this structuralism manifested within his Marxism?
Yes, I am comfortable with a description of him as a structuralist, and I think looking back, he was, with, say, Claude Lévi-Strauss, probably the most important of the structuralists. But he, Althusser that is, actually developed into post-structuralism, in my view. He signposted a way to post-structuralism, and in some ways people forget that he came out of structuralism, and he certainly was a structuralist Marxist. I think the issue to do with him as a Theoretical Times theorist is quite important, because we started this podcast series, and listeners will realise where we're going at the end of this podcast today, with Lucio Colletti. And Colletti and Althusser were very important parallel theorists in different countries in Europe, but they were the main European Marxist theorists, the main European philosophers, in my view, of the 1960s and possibly even the early 1970s. And Althusser certainly was writing well into the 1970s before tragedy struck. But I think they're very important to compare. And a structuralist Marxist like Althusser and a Delavolpian philosopher like Colletti actually, as we know from earlier podcasts, actually wrote to each other. And there was a dialogue within European Marxism, within what Perry Anderson later called it, the tracks of historical materialism, which today has been lost. And I think we need to get back on those tracks. And you certainly should start with structuralist Marxism.
I agree with you. And you realise, and you try to not be nostalgic about this, Steve, but you realise when you go through these great scholars and their correspondence with each other, that we really have a disconnected intellectual environment at the moment. Yes, we have email. Yes, we have Twitter. Yes, we have Facebook. Yes, we have LinkedIn. Can you imagine structuralist Marxists commenting on LinkedIn? But that doesn't quite seem to cut it in terms of the dialogue that these guys and gals had. And so, therefore, when I'm talking to you about that pivot of structuralism, post-structuralism and Althusser, what do you think is the impact of May 1968 on that? It seems we've often gone back to the pivot of May 1968. Is that relevant to Althussers?
It is, but in some ways it's a closure. Weirdly, it's a closure. Because you mentioned Lenin philosophy, and I studied by reading for Marx, poor Marx in French, and reading Capital. And they were written before 1968. Reading Capital was written in 1965. Yes. And I think we forget, and it's the same with Coletti, that we forget there's a history to these people's writing, and a massive European philosophy legacy, which you can't just capture on social media and Twitter.
No, 140 characters can't quite capture it.
I've tried, and I've failed miserably. So I think the interesting thing about Althusser is that unlike people who were his protégés, the Badious, people like Rancière and Balibar, who actually wrote Reading Capital with Louis Althusser, and Rancière and Balibar are still going strong today. So is Badiou, another person we looked at in the earlier Theoretical Times podcasts. People like Rancière were Althusser's students and colleagues, and it was an extremely important period. 1968 was an incredibly important period, but also it could be seen as a period of closure, that the influence that Althusser had afterwards actually wasn't as great as he had before. I think what happened particularly with Althusser, people have to remember that he had what we would call bipolar disorder today, and he was he was prisoner of war in Germany, and basically it sent him mad. And, we forget what the legacy of the Second World War was in many ways. And his tragedy in strangling his wife in later life, was the culmination of many, many years of what we would call today bipolar disorder, and, tremendous mental problems. But amongst all of the people that we've looked at in these Theoretical Times podcasts, actually he's maybe the most prodigious. And as you say, his work is hard to read, really, really hard to read, when you come to it for the first time. And he was trying to create a series of concepts within what he saw as a scientific historical materialism, which would actually explain everything. He wasn't talking a little bit about law or art or science over here. He was trying to explain things in Marxist terms, but across the board. It was a prodigious effort. And really, we're pygmies compared to Althusser today.
I think we often forget about the ambition of Marxist philosophy, particularly in the Althusserian ilk, that it was not the cliched explanation for everything, but an attempt to really understand the world. And I remember we were in a PhD seminar last week, and the PhD student had involved a bit of Althussers, but also quoted sort of Bourdieu and a few other theorists. And I often, and it gets me into a lot of trouble, Stephen, refer to Bourdieu, not Badiou, Bourdieu, as Althusser with his head kicked in, or Althusser for beginners, or Althusser light. So people that don't quite get Althusser seem to magically get drawn to Bourdieu, don't they? But we've already mentioned a few friendships in his life, and part of this Theoretical Times podcast has been about intellectual life fleshed out and intellectual friendships. We've talked about a few, but what were the key relationships with other scholars in his life and work? And we could start with Marx if you like, but what were the friendships? What were the key relationships?
Yes, I think that the key relationships, certainly in theoretical terms, were with people like Marx, Spinoza, Freud, and he introduced Lacan to the world in many ways. Lacan had been a psychoanalyst for a long time, but we have to remember how Althusser worked Lacan into his theory of ideology and the subject and so on. But he actually did write letters, not tweets, to lots and lots of people, and Coletti is one of them. And we've looked at Coletti earlier on in the Theoretical Times podcast. And actually they wrote to each other for quite a long time, as they were the most important European philosophers just at that time. And I'm trying to excavate those letters and to look at them. But Althusser was a great writer, actually, to other people a lot of the time. I think there's a real history still to be uncovered. And there is an Althusser studies movement and journal. I think there's still a lot to excavate. I really do. And I think, as you say, we had a PhD student talking about this the other day. You feel that Althusser is coming back in many ways.
Yes.
And that is really interesting, that people will go back to his work. But I suppose that, in some ways, the most important other theorist is somebody like Hegel. And that's why Coletti and Althusser are important. Because Hegel was turned on his head by Marx, and I think at the time Coletti and Althusser were the great interpreters of Hegel. And it's quite interesting that someone like Slavoj Žižek, who is now one of our theoretical times foci, he takes a completely different Hegelian, much more Hegelian direction, which I think actually is problematic. And I think if we go back to Althusser and Coletti on this, we learn a lot more. And I think for the future direction of theory we should do. But I think he had a lot of political relationships. Althusser had a lot of political relationships. People forget that he was heavily involved in the PCI, the PCF, French Communist Party. And that was an extremely important life trajectory for him. He was fighting Stalinism from within the French Communist Party.
And that got him into a lot of trouble and a lot of complexity around his relationship with Stalinism.
It did. And I think in many ways, a bit like Coletti in Italy and the PCI, you can't really separate the work from that political work in many ways.
Yes, and it's not surprising that we're going to go to ideology now. And Althusser stated, it's amazing how many of our theoretical time scholars, by the way, are great with aphorisms. But Althusser stated that, quote, oh, I love this, I've lived my life through this, and I don't know if I agree with it, but Althusser stated, quote, ideology has no history, end of quote. How has this maxim impacted, do you think, on his theorisation of ideological state apparatuses?
It's an interesting aphorism, but I think his work on ideology really did come from, it came from a great reading of philosophers and theorists, particularly Marx, but I think it was what he saw within the contemporary capitalist world and within the French Communist Party, which he joined after the war, and actually really was struggling with how ideology works in a practical way for many years. He wasn't just doing it as a lecture, and I think we have to remember that. But I think particularly his idea of ISAs and RSAs, that is, ideological state apparatuses and repressive state apparatuses, certainly at the time, in the 1960s and 70s, these were massively influential theorizations of ideology.
And they still are.
And they should be
relevant. Still
absolutely at the forefront today. I think they got lost. Like with a lot of this stuff, we threw the baby out with the bathwater. And Althusser's work, and early work and later work, still really does pay dividends if you read it in terms of the ISAs and RSAs. I think that theory of ideology, and particularly the theory of the subject, actually permeates a lot of the work. And I found, particularly with law and criminology, which is where I started, that the RSAs were very useful in the idea of the RSAs. It was a very useful idea in trying to understand how law worked. That law wasn't just simply violence or discipline. It was a much more subtle form in modern society than that. And Althusser theorised that extremely well. So there were ways in which you could look at, forms like law, ideologically, with his passwords, as far as I'm concerned. I really do think ISAs and RSAs, which would fit into Twitter very neatly, by the way.
What I think is so amazing, Steve, about thinking through ISAs and RSAs now is, for example, something as simple as we were at a wedding on Saturday night dealing with a policeman, a career copper, and what I found quite remarkable is it was almost as if he had read Althusser, because his subtle configuration of power, the different modes and modalities through which police operate, for example, who you would perhaps configure as both an ISA and an RSA in different forms, but his awareness of power and violence and the multiple trajectories of policing also, I think, shows the relevance of ISAs and RSAs to policing. It
certainly does. I agree, and I think it was quite interesting that postman, although he was in Western Australia, had actually studied at Charles Sturt University, where we were professors,
Yes.
as part of his training.
Yes.
And I think the idea of forms like law and police actually fitting into both RSAs and ISAs is really important. So the subtlety of how, say, policing or law work has to be complex, and it has to be thought in a complex way. And that's what I think what Althusser was trying to do. He may have failed in some aspects of that, but it seems to me that the ideas in ISAs and RSAs and their relationship are still really important today. He may not have solved every problem with that, but he certainly pointed us in the right direction. And you're right, even people's conversations around a wedding table are able to capture that.
Agreed. And what I always find interesting, Steve, is, and again, we've seen it a lot in the doctoral work we've done this year. We're sitting in December 2014 in glorious Western Australia. Listeners may be hearing the rustle of breeze and wind around us. We're on the beach. We're in Mandurah.
And the smell of the Indian Ocean.
Yes, we can smell the Indian Ocean. It is Western Australian summer at its absolute most glorious, but there is a rustle of wind around, so I apologise. But what is interesting in 2014, reflecting back on it and all the doctoral examinations and work that we've done, is what I've been seeing a great deal, and maybe it's the sort of work I've been examining, but I've been seeing basically dumbed down Foucault.
Yes.
So the theorisation of power I've been engaging with has been basically they've read Discipline and Punish. In fact, they haven't really read Discipline and Punish. They've read the Regicide and then read sort of some cliff notes, and that is their theorisation of power. And for me, one of the consequences, I think, of really not taking Althusser seriously, losing him for about 10 years in our history of ideas, is Foucault came back, but it was a dumbed down Foucault, and our theorisation of power wasn't profound. And I think Althusser's theorisation of power is profound.
And I do think it's important that Foucault, say Discipline and Punish, gets published in English, certainly in 1977. And it's at a time when Althusser had been really, really important, and he's now starting to wane.
Yes.
And my argument, partly in this Theoretical Times project, is that actually Foucault has been misleading for us. Foucault on power has been misleading for us, partly because I see him as anti-statist.
Yes.
And I think what Althusser was able to do was theorise the state and power very subtly. And actually we need him more than ever today. And I think what Foucault started to... the trajectory that Foucault started to lead us down, and it's gone all over the world, that anti-statism is really important. It's actually the wrong way. And Althusser saw that before Foucault, actually.
Yeah.
And they were quite interesting rivals in the European world of the 1970s, but actually we took a wrong direction.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, particularly in ideology and ideological state apparatuses, Althusser, I think, stated that, quote, the reproduction of labour power requires not only reproduction of its skills, but also at the same time a reproduction of its submission to the rules of the established order, end of quote. Now that's amazing. So how relevant is this reproduction of subjection now? I
think it's crucial. I think that idea, which I've often talked about, Marx's idea of the double freedom, that we only have in capitalist society our labour power to sell, but that we do have that labour power to sell. We can sell it to anybody, but all that we have is our labour power, is as important as ever. But actually the discipline necessary, the ideology necessary to sell your labour power, to be in a position to sell your labour power rather than sit on the beach by the Indian Ocean, is actually very, very important. And Althusser saw that. He saw that in the 1970s. And I certainly think if he was alive today, he would see it now.
So therefore, and we've talked a little bit about state and anti-statism, and a lot of your work in the last 3-4 years has really dealt with the state and anti-statism. My work much less so, and I've been very inspired by yours. But what particular value does Althusser's rendering of the state offer to us now?
Well, I think it makes us concentrate our minds. I mean, one of the problems today is the libertarian idea, which I think comes from people like Foucault, actually, and I think it's wrong-headed, that, we don't really need, actually, repressive state apparatuses, okay? Well, we do, because as capitalism becomes meaner and nastier and greedier and more global,
it's got more repressive.
And it's not very nice when people start to fall apart and societies start to fall apart. That's what I mean about the anti-statism. We may not like aspects of the state. We might not like repressive state apparatuses, but actually an understanding of them and the need for them sometimes. I don't think there's ever not a need, actually, for repressive state apparatuses, as well as ideological state apparatuses, in whatever society. I think Althusser provides us with a good way of theorising that. And, the sort of libertarian idea that people can just do what they like, well, look at the society to come.
Yes. To quote Dr. Phil, how's that working for you?
How is that working for you?
Yeah.
The great theorist, Dr. Phil.
The great theorist, Dr. Phil McGraw. After the murder of his wife, and can I say, listeners, this is the disturbing question for a wife to ask one's husband. After the murder of his wife, how and why do you think Althusser has been revived in popularity? And there is no doubt, as we've talked about, all the anniversaries are being acknowledged, the publishing is back, the citations are back, and as we've talked about, some theorists here in the series that we've been doing haven't really been successful. They've stayed in the analogue age. We've talked quite often about Althussers, again, who had a fantastic theorisation of the state.
Another influenced by Althusser.
Althusser, and he really hasn't made it through in some ways. Althusser, with all the problems, the mental health concerns, and indeed the murder of his wife, he is back.
Yes.
So how and why is that revival happening?
Well, I think these things actually do go in cycles. But the tragedy for Althusser was in some ways that he was on the brink of this legacy, and he killed his wife. And he never went to trial for it. It's interesting that The Future Lasts a Long Time, which is his great autobiography, and I think everybody should read that. And of course, The Future does last a long time. He was right. Future Lasts a Long Time is the English translation of his autobiography. And basically what that book does is provide a legal justification for the terrible tragedy. It's almost like the defence he would have used if he'd ever gone to trial. And it's quite interesting in terms of legal thought and juristic thought, jurisprudence and criminology, which I'm very interested in. There is now an Althusser and law book actually published in the Critical Legal Theorist series Nomikoi by Routledge. Which
and
is
that's a great series, by the way.
Wonderful series, really recommend it, and edited by Peter Goodrich. Good shout out to Peter.
Hi, Peter.
And it's interesting that Althusser and Law is one of the volumes, series of essays produced in that series. But actually, other theorists in the Theoretical Times podcast series are also being looked at. So there's one coming out on Zizek and Law, and one next year on Badian Law. But Althusser and Law, for example, is now starting to be an area of study for PhD students or for jurists. And I think in some ways, the cycle of the times has come back, and Althusser is important. But also, the legacy is being picked up. So last year, there was actually a Reading Capital conference, Lille Capital Conference. It was supposed to be a 50-year anniversary of 1965 when the book was actually first published. They got to 48, I think. They couldn't wait any longer. So it was a conference in America where Etienne Balibar, who wrote Reading Capital with Louis Althusser, actually spoke.
Oh, wow.
And there's a conference on Balibar, in fact, at the moment in the USA. So really interesting. But I think the idea that you could have a conference on a book nearly 50 years later is astonishing. It's part of the fundamental presuppositions of Theoretical Times, which is that people have a craving for this stuff. They really do, and this is now the time of theory, as Slavoj Žižek said, and doesn't it prove it? Doesn't it show in Althusser? And I think what people will find is that he's actually more relevant to the times than we ever thought he was in the 1960s and 70s.
And can I also do a shout-out? Obviously, our area of media communication and cultural studies has kept the faith to a certain extent with Althusser, regardless of the wife strangling incident.
Yes.
But can I also say, because I'm currently involved in teacher education as well at Charles Sturt University, and I think the lack of engagement with Althusser in teacher education, in education studies more generally, is a deep and profound problem, because Bourdieu has won.
Bourdieu is Althusser light, as you said.
In teacher education. How many seminars have we been into in teacher education where cultural capital, out it comes?
Yeah.
And I can't count the number of times I've said, so how are you theorising power? And why aren't you dealing with ISAs and RSAs? Because that's a much more subtle theorisation, particularly thinking about schools. And if you think about Illich's Deschooling Society, I think, again, teacher education, that was a problematic book in lots of ways in terms of sort of, hippies, man, and anarcho-syndicalism and so forth. But there was a pretty complex theorisation of power in education there that had a couple of fingerprints of Althusser on it as well.
Yes.
So I think we've left that really complicated theorisation of power and teaching behind us in
Very
some
much
ways.
so, and I think that thing about throwing the baby out with the bathwater happened there. I think Althusser got replaced by Bourdieu.
Yes.
He really did in the 1970s, so that students and teachers all around the world started to pick up on Pierre Bourdieu and at the same time replaced theorists like Althusser. It's now interesting that someone like Althusser is coming back, and Bourdieu's problems, and I think there are lots of problems with his structuralism, are showing.
They are, and I think one of the reasons teacher education is getting such a political buffeting at the moment is because we are lacking that really complex theorisation of not only power but relationship with the state.
Yes.
And if we have a good engagement with Althusser, that may return. So therefore, Steve, my last question of you is where we're going now. So we've just finished our 6th theorist in theoretical times, Louis Althusser, as we can see and hear from listeners. This is going to be quite an important pivot in the work, but it's a pivot to where?
Yes, it is an important pivot, and now we can reveal to listeners
Ooh.
the direction of the next 6 podcasts. Theoretical Times was an idea which has been incredibly helped by these podcasts and discussions and feedback, actually, because the work was, over a long period, looking at particular theorists, and they were Althusser, Colletti, Baudrillard, Virilio, then more recently Badiou, Zizek. And there are reasons for picking those people out. And they linked to Althusser because Althusser was a great example of someone who generated theoretical concepts out of work that he already read. And that's actually my method. That's what I was doing in all the 6 theorists that we've chosen. We could have looked at other people, but they were the main ones. And I was doing that because I wanted to develop work which was more relevant to contemporary times and to my own particular interests. And the next 6 podcasts are going to look at those concepts which I have generated out of these theorists. And the groundwork, I think, was very important to do in the earlier 6 podcasts on the theorists, because I think you need to say who these people are, what sort of work they were doing. But the next 6 podcasts are looking at particular concepts which are being developed to try and explain all sorts of aspects of contemporary times.
Well, I think that's absolutely tremendous. And on behalf of Steve and myself, from the glorious Indian Ocean, I hope you're feeling the balminess of it. Of course, the sea breeze is in, so I hope the podcast came out great, guys. But we want to particularly thank all the listeners. And there have been tens of thousands of you out there from right around the world.
I'm really grateful.
I can't even capture the scale of the international scale of the listeners. So thank you so much to everybody who has downloaded and listened to the first 6. The next 6 will come, and they'll be much more, I'd imagine, aggressively argued in the
Conversations.
Conversations, thank you. Yeah, let's hope it is. Remember, Althusser with his missus. So I hope it is a great experience for you. They'll probably be appearing, actually, during December and January of 2014, 2015. But thank you to everybody who has listened to these podcasts, and particularly thank you to our colleagues all around the world who have tweeted us, who have got in contact with us via Facebook or via our email. Amazing. And we really appreciate you, and we appreciate really complicated thinking, which is what all of us should be doing in university. So thank you to you all, and a big thank you to Steve, and let's move on to the next 6. thank you for listening to this podcast on Theoretical Times by Tara Brabazon and Steve Redhead. Please feel free to contact us at Charles Sturt University.